As mentioned in the previous video, Dutton documents studies exploring gender symmetry in domestic violence within teenage and adult relationship contexts. The study by Watson and colleagues revealed that only 9% of the respondents reported exclusive abuse, while female students presented a greater likelihood of reporting aggressive responses and male students were more likely to do nothing about being victims of abuse. This revelation contradicts popular feminist presentation of female-perpetrated violence as out of self-defense and is supported Whittaker and colleagues' findings that 70% of non-reciprocal violence is perpetrated by women. Strauss in the 2010 article also notes contradiction in the presentation of female-perpetrated violence as self-defense in the World Health Organization report. Particularly, some of the references used, such as Saunders, note that most of the violence, both minor and severe, is not out of retaliation, but the organization uses the references and cites articles that provide completely contradictory information from what is asserted. Hahn highlights greater rates of self-defense among men at 56% compared to women at 42%. There are similar violence motivations for women, as those of men, including anger, punishing misbehavior, coercion, fury, jealousy, and frustration. Central to the feminist presentation of domestic violence is that men use power to dominate women. However, Strauss documents 6 studies that highlight the contribution of dominance by either partner to domestic violence. Variations in the what is defined as violence does not affect the response with extreme violence, but this phenomenon differs in the context of men and women. While women are essentially allowed, at least socially and legally, to express negative emotions and communication issues through physical aggression, men are required to walk off negative emotions since law enforcement agencies do not care about the context of the violence. Follingstad and colleagues associate anxious attachment with angry temperaments, and eventual control. Controlling behaviors significantly contribute to angry temperaments, which guide the frequency and severity of dating violence. Douglas and Strauss' study of 2003 reported that adolescent girls were 115% more likely to perpetrate violence compared to their male counterparts. The study noted some countries where severe assault was more female than male perpetrated. Particularly, the rate of female against male perpetrated violence was 296% for New Zealand, 457% for Singapore, and 552% for Scotland. The rates of male and female perpetrated injury were 8.1%, with 2.6% being serious, 6.1%, with 1.2% being serious. Longitudinal cohort studies are perceived to be soundly designed because of large samples, flexible ages free of self-selection, greater external validity, the deduction of cause-effect relationships, and the unfreezing of behavior since they are conducted over time. The Concordia Longitudinal Risk Project of 1976 completed in Montreal is an example of a longitudinal cohort study which uncovered that aggressive children registered lower IQs and poor academic achievement. Aggression among girls was linked to preference for aggressive males, with the female participants registering increased likelihood of uncontrolled illicit drug use. The aggressive group presented serious mental issues during their late teens, and aggressive girls became aggressive mothers, a phenomenon commonly ignored by the agencies interested in domestic violence as documented by Dutton. The Dunedin longitudinal cohort study completed in New Zealand registered more women partner and self-reported physical abuse. Pre-existing traits in women during their teenage years informed the choice of abusive partners and the use of violence. A review of the Dunedin study uncovered various predictors of female-perpetrated violence, including poor self-control, emotional instability, excessive jealousy, and approved use of aggression. Antisocial teenage behavior among women is a predictor of perpetrating violence in adult relationships. The conclusion of the Dunedin study is perceived to be somewhat controversial, with the assertion that males present 2 variations of antisocial behavior, that is, against strangers, which was associated with neurological disorders, and intimate partners, while female antisocial behavior is only against intimate partners. The Concordia study and the Dunedin studies uncovered unique development and manifestation of female aggression, which invalidates the presentation of female-perpetrated abuse as primarily retaliatory. Clinically abusive relationships are evaluated by different professionals, such as those in law enforcement, courts, and hospital settings. Women have more access to abuse-related services compared to men, which would explain the findings of agency data. Dutton also documents that United States National Youth Survey between 1976 and 1992 uncovered that the rate and severity of female-perpetrated violence was double that of men. One-sided non-reciprocal violence was twice as likely to report female perpetration for both male and female victims. The New York Children in the Community study was conducted over 20 years revealed that conduct disorders predict the perpetration of violence, with women exhibiting patterns of unusual beliefs, interpersonal avoidance, and mistrust being more likely to abuse their intimate partners. The National Comorbidity Survey in the United States indicates similar rates or frequency of minor physical victimization exceeding perpetration, and severe violence between men and women as analyzed by Kessler and colleagues and documented by Dutton. The Oregon Youth Study analyzed by Capaldi and colleagues who report a high frequency of bidirectional abuse in intimate relationships, gender symmetry in abusive behaviors, and antisocial characteristics being greater predictors of female compared to male perpetrated intimate partner abuse. Koko and Pulkkinen in analyzing the Finnish study postulate that female perpetrated violence is popular, shares similar frequency as male perpetrated violence, and is independent of intimate partner actions owing to the development of history beyond the current relationship, thereby discrediting the presentation of female perpetrated violence as self-defense. The authors also note that the types of violence in the order of frequency are mutual violence, female more severe, and male more severe. Strauss article of 2010 maintains that the symmetrical or asymmetrical nature of domestic violence debate started after the National Family Violence Survey of 1975 that reported similar rates of violence perpetration between men and women, that is, 12% and 11.6% respectively. The rates of severe violence, which comprised of attacks with objects, choking, punching, and kicking were also similar at 3.8% and 4.6% for men and women respectively. Subsequent publications by Strauss uncovered that familial and societal characteristics significantly contribute to intimate partner violence. Some of the gender symmetry findings from completed studies are presented on this table. As you can see, some of the studies indicate that the perpetration of violence is symmetrical while others indicate that women are more violent than men. However, such studies are actively hidden or withheld from the public and all the relevant stakeholders using some weird strategies that will be discussed in a different video. It is worth noting that equal perpetration rates do not translate to mutuality. However, mutual violence is more common than often reported as presented in this table. Strauss maintains that symmetry also exists in meanings, contexts, motives, and risk factors as will be discussed later on. Family literature is heavily divided on whether domestic violence is symmetrical or asymmetrical. The feminist perspective, by authors such as Kurtz and Dobash and colleagues, widely documents empirical evidence that men are the perpetrators of domestic violence and women are the victims in the context of heterosexual relationships. The family violence perspective also presents rich evidence suggesting that women, and by extension, wives, are as violent as men are, if not more. Johnson argues that the possibility of both perspectives being accurate is based on a number of reasons. First, domestic abuse is not a unitary occurrence. Second, the researcher groups utilize varying methodologies, including approaches to sampling. Third, the chosen methodologies address different types of violence. And finally, the types of abuse differ in the context of the gender. Jonathan divides the violence into intimate terrorism, where one of the parties is both violent and controlling, violent resistance, where a party is violent but not controlling and the other one is violent and controlling, situational violence, where no one is violent or controlling, and mutual violence, where both parties are violent and controlling. The differences in whether violence is symmetrical or asymmetrical are based on the fact that violent resistance and intimate terrorism dominate agency data samples, such as police reports and crime studies, while situational violence is common in general survey. In other words, the feminist perspective of domestic violence, which presents men as the primary aggressors, relies on institutional samples from shelters, hospitals, courts, and law enforcement, while family violence data uses samples deemed to be more representative. The 2011 study by Strauss highlights over 200 other studies that find gender symmetry in intimate partner violence. The study revealed that ordinary violence, which including throwing objects, pushing, and slapping, is common in the general population, while severe violence, which includes punching and choking, is prevalent in the clinical population and is male-dominant. The study supports Johnson's assertion that situational violence is prevalent in the general population, but disputes that intimate terrorism is exclusively perpetrated by men by citing 91 empirical studies that indicated symmetry in the perpetration of injurious assault. The presentation of intimate terrorism as a preserve for men, Strauss argues, is based on using studies that only cover assaults by men. Data from the general population reveals that intimate terrorism is symmetrical. Strauss observes that the nature of domestic violence controversy is based on the fact that the researchers who support symmetry focus on perpetration, while those who support asymmetry focus on effects or outcomes. Focusing on prevention uncovers the popularity of symmetry, thereby validating the development of both male and female-oriented programs. The outcomes of the study conflict with the presentation of intimate partner violence as a patriarchal crime used by men to dominate and control women. Jonathan argues that approaches to studying domestic violence are flawed because agency data is biased and the so-called representative samples are dominated by high refusal rates that adversely affect the randomness of resultant samples. Comparing the sources of symmetry and asymmetry results in the revelation of two dominant forms of violence, that is, intimate terrorism and situational violence. Situational violence is less likely to be included in agency data due to minimal reporting, while couples in intimate terrorism situations are likely to be included in general surveys because of retaliation fears. Jonathan asserts that failing to consider the causes, nature, development, consequences, and the differentiated interventions of domestic violence eliminates the possibility of drawing accurate conclusions on the true picture of domestic violence. Strauss concludes that symmetry exists in perpetration, and asymmetry in the outcomes of violence. Male-perpetrated violence is associated with the greater risk of death, injury, which is both psychological and physical, and fear. This phenomenon supports the need for continued support for women who experience violence. However, the support for women should not come at the expense of access to similar services for men, since injury and mental health issues are reported by both men and women. Particularly, Strauss explains that men sustain a third of all injuries and deaths associated with domestic violence. The risk of injury and likelihood of violence are both heightened when both parties are violent. Mutual violence accounts for a half to two-thirds all partner violence as documented by Strauss. The arguments against symmetry in the perpetration of violence often focus on the outcomes of violence as opposed to the root causes and the perpetration. These arguments inform the perception of female-perpetrated violence as less harmful, thereby making it less of a social problem. The continued denial of gender symmetry in the perpetration of domestic violence has guided the development of programs that exclusively address male perpetration of violence. The unfortunate truth is the fact that greater harm in female victims of abuse is automatically linked to male perpetration of violence, which informs ignoring female perpetration in interventions. Failure to solve female perpetration of violence minimizes the efficacy of existing interventions, as explained by Whitaker and colleagues who document Smith and colleagues' meta-analysis. The meta-analysis revealed that female perpetration of domestic violence is the strongest predictor of one being a victim. Thus, failing to address female-perpetrated violence implies that interventions focusing exclusively on men only solve half the problem.